Happy 4th of July weekend. As by way of confession, I'm one of those people who get sort of weepy when the Star-Spangled Banner is played in person. And some of you know that I am at my most vulnerable at a rodeo when that horse flies our flag around that arena. I can feel it rising in me right now as I even talk about it. July 4th is our nation's celebration of adopting the Declaration of Independence in 1776. 240 some odd years ago, our Continental Congress told the world that the 13 colonies on this soil were no longer property of the British Empire, but were now a new nation. Congress actually approved our independence 2 days before, on this day, on July 2nd. But our legislature needed an extra 2 days to draft a document whose words burn within us even today. The second paragraph, perhaps more famous than the first: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And at the end of that document, we recognize the great signatures of that era. William Whipple, John Hancock, Samuel and John Adams, the list goes on. We celebrate this weekend seeing family and friends. We may occasionally read our declaration, but what we don't often do is contemplate the suffering that was involved in our revolution. Tarrytown, Valley Forge, Lexington. We did indeed declare our independence in 1776, but the colonies fought for another 7 years at the cost of 50,000 colonial lives. Reminds us that documents may be written, resolutions voted for and passed, but it is by other means we gain our freedoms and give our allegiances. This is serious business. And it is this business that brings us to our reading in Genesis, known by many names: the binding of Isaac. This reading is by far the most unsettling. There's no need to return to it. I invite you to reread it during the week. As horrific as this story is, it remains the foundation of faith from the ancient Hebrews right through the Jews of today. The binding of Isaac is important. How can this be? How can a story so full of horror become important to a nation? And I have to tell you that there is quicksand were I to stand here and tell you what other faith communities believe. I'll leave that to others. But what I can do is sketch out a very few scenarios that may make sense as we try to grapple with this text that was written down roughly 2,500 years ago. You see, we get bound up in the story as we read it. We read it as if it were modern, but it is not a modern story. How could Abraham do such a thing? What is Isaac thinking as he makes that long walk to Mount Moriah? And did God really ask Abraham to do this? Let's look at just a couple of vignettes. First is when the people of Jerusalem were conquered and taken back to Babylon in 597 before Christ. What a shock that must have been, to have the best and the brightest of a city taken away and be incorporated into enemy territory. The rabbis of old wrote about this, about the binding of Isaac as a way to understand how the unthinkable had happened. Jerusalem had fallen. The chosen people of God had been laid low. They were somehow unworthy of God's protection, or so the story goes. The chosen people did not give themselves to their God, and so the worst happened. See how that works? If we move forward centuries, the rabbis wrote of the binding during the Six-Day War in 1967 between Arab states and Israel. Can there be anything more frightening than war? Diaries of Israel's founding fathers, too old to fight, called up their sons and daughters to fight for their country. Specter of the binding of Isaac is incredibly potent in Israel, especially as those sons and daughters gave themselves or returned so scarred as to be objects of pity. These images, terrible as they are, reveal much about our Christian heritage also. The early believers adopted the use of the binding to demonstrate the importance of Christ giving himself for each one of us. And this is where we can get that something as simple as a flag, bits of colored cloth really, can begin to take on the very soul of a country it represents. In the same way, this old and horrific story, perhaps told around campfires in the ancient Near East, it becomes a vehicle to bring understanding to the impossible to understand. Both flag and the binding become like a totem, a sacred symbol of a nation that leads us to ourselves. These totems are powerful in our lives, whether we recognize them or not. They are archetypal in their essence and depth. In ways we may not even be aware of, we use these images to explain our world. How is it possible for Christians to engage this story of the binding? Now, for some believers, we can see through the darkness of this story to find simple trust. Trust that God and humans will come together in ways that, in the end, will build up rather than tear down, even in the most trying of times. Our story of Abraham and Isaac suggests that through faith and standing with one's God, life will be restored, different perhaps, in ways we cannot imagine or perhaps even desire. But life will be restored. As you leave this morning into your celebrations, go with an eye to those things in your life that give you the deepest meaning: God, family, friends, the stories that paint your very soul. Protect these things with all you have, even if on the surface they don't have the shine that we would desire. Use them to find your own way to your very center. Never fear that journey. Use whatever tools are provided along the way, even the story of a binding. Use them to find your way to your very center, and there you will find the one who gives life and meaning and purpose. It is there where you will find your God. So go forth this day with joy, knowing that you will be with the people and in the places that you love, that make you who you are. Love them and love your God. Amen.